What the heck is a grenade? This is like the kind of spelling error I'd expect to see in an old NES game, not in a game made by somebody who actually knows how to speak English. You know, I really don't know what to think about this game. Now, today's ancient DOS game is Moraff's World, and in many ways it's a unique game with a lot of imagination and many elements that you just really didn't see in games in the early 90s. But it also likes to cheat, and some aspects of the game aren't well tested either, so I just don't know. This game is hugely nostalgic for me, and I was actually able to beat it for my first time while capturing gameplay footage for today's episode. So it's not that the game is broken, it just feels like an amateur game. But it also feels professional too. And this is just a really strange case of a game that by all logic should be panned, derided, heavily criticized, etc. But lots of people like this game, and I don't blame them, because despite how atypical and annoying it can be, it's still fun to play. I just can't figure out why. Well, let's get the game stats out of the way, and maybe we can then figure it out together. Moraff's World was created and released by Steve Moraff in 1991 under his Moraffware banner, though nowadays his company goes by the name of Software Diversions and normally deals with Mahjong software. It's a one-player first-person dungeon crawl featuring support for a massive array of video modes. Now, the best mode most people could use back in the day was probably going to be the 360 by 480 tweaked VGA mode with 256 colors. Though truth be told, the game only uses 16 colors for pretty much everything except the mouse cursor and cursor selectors. So playing in 640 by 480 16 color VGA mode is actually better. Though the game also has some of the earliest support for SVGA graphics, but you need to have the proper chipset to take advantage of these modes. Thankfully, Dosbox does properly support one of the chipsets that the game can utilize, and thus all the footage I recorded is from the game's 1024 by 768 256 color SVGA mode. As far as sound is concerned, there is PC speaker sound, but it's just lame and not worth having on at all, so I recommend keeping it off. As for its current release date, it's still shareware and still available from the Software Diversions website at www.softwarediversions.com by checking out the Classic RPG Games section on the menu bar. To buy the game alone costs $10, or you can buy the game along with its predecessor Moraff's Revenge and its sequel Moraff's Dungeons of the Unforgiven for $19, which also includes a couple bonus games as well. So since there's no story to this game, let's dive right into character creation. You first choose your race, which determines how tall you stand in the dungeons and what kind of stats you can expect to roll, but otherwise doesn't have a major effect on your character. Next you roll your stats, which you have 6 of: Strength, Agility/Dexterity, since the game actually refers to the stat both ways, Intelligence, Wisdom, Constitution, and Luck, which respectively determine how much damage you can do, how easily you can dodge attacks and get extra strikes, how many spell points you get, how powerful a handful of the spells are, how many health points you get, and how often you find stuff after defeating enemies. Lastly, you choose your class from a list of 7, including Fighter, Worshipper, Monk, Wizard, Priest, Sage, and Mage. This is the most important decision you will make, as it will drastically affect how you play the game. The Fighter is the worst possible class you could play as. Don't even bother, because it's virtually impossible to survive later on with the Fighter. The Worshipper and Priest are similar to each other and have a selection of powerful defensive magic spells to help them out, the differences between them being that the Priest can fight better, but the Worshipper gets more spell points. The Wizard, though, gets more spell points than any other class and gets access to powerful attack magic, but can barely engage in melee combat at all. The Monk and Sage are very curious classes to play as, and they're similar in that they both get access to every spell in the game, with the Monk actually knowing every single spell right from the get-go. The trouble is that both of these classes don't get many spell points, so you have to be very conservative with your magic. The Monk has much better fighting skills than the Sage, but isn't allowed to carry most items and doesn't get anywhere near as many health points, as the Sage gets a ridiculous amount of health. Lastly is the Mage, which is essentially a fighter-wizard combo that's extremely powerful in the long run. I recommend new players choose the Priest or Mage. I myself decided to go with the Sage this time around for the added challenge of having very limited spell points. Once you get into the gameplay, you might be a little confused as to how to get started. The main game screen actually has you looking in all 4 cardinal directions all at the same time, and you simply use the arrow keys to move north, east, south, or west as desired. Unlike the vast majority of first-person games where you move forward and backwards after turning to face in the direction you want to move in. It takes a little to get used to this style of movement, but eventually you're going to find you just tend to focus on the map at the left side of the screen and only look at the first-person views when something interesting shows up like a monster or a ladder. The corners of the screen are pretty self-explanatory. The upper left is where messages show up, the upper right is your list of controls, the lower left are basic stats like health and experience, and the lower right are your 6 attributes. You always start the game in the town at the top of the dungeon. The different colored squares on the map indicate ladders which lead up into various kinds of locations. The red squares represent the inns where you can rest to restore your magic power and level up if you have enough experience points. The orange squares head out into the wilderness, which I'll talk more about later. The brown squares are banks where you can convert all the stones you find on your journey into jewel pieces, which is the form of currency in this game. The blue squares are equipment stores where you can buy weapons and armor. Unfortunately, you can't sell weapons or armor, so if you ever end up with a weapon or a piece of armor you don't want, the only thing you can do about it is lose it. Lastly, the yellow squares are the temples. You can pay the temples money to restore your health, but this is pretty impractical and expensive. So instead, you'll mostly be using the temples to cure yourself of poisons and diseases should you contract them, and you'll also come here to buy special contracts to raise you from the dead should you die during your adventure. While the game states that there really isn't any ultimate goal short of becoming wealthy and powerful, there are several boss monsters inhabiting the dungeons, so I like to think that defeating these monsters is sort of like a pseudo-goal, especially since you get some really powerful equipment when you defeat them. Now, the shareware version of this game has 4 of these boss monsters inhabiting the 4th, 8th, 12th, and 16th floors of the dungeon. The full game adds 4 more of these beasts called the Red Dragons, which inhabit the 125th, 150th, 175th, and 200th floors of the dungeon. That's right, 200 floors in pseudo-randomly generated dungeons. Actually, even though that sounds impressive, the dungeon layouts themselves aren't anything special, and really they only serve as the backdrop to fighting monsters, which is really where the meat of the game is. The dungeon floors themselves don't have anything special to offer really, just a bunch of ladders going up and down, some doors, some false walls, some trapdoors, which are really important, but most of all, chutes. Chutes are going to be the bane of your existence in this game because they are everywhere and force you to fall down to lower levels of the dungeon where you'll be more vulnerable to attack than before. And while trying to get back up, you'll undoubtedly fall down even more chutes. Thankfully though, every time you re-enter a dungeon floor that you've already been to, any chutes that happen to be in the areas that you've mapped out will be identified so that you can avoid them more easily. But yeah, since there's not really anything to do in the dungeon short of fighting monsters, that's what you're pretty much going to be spending 99% of the game doing, fighting monsters. Now the monsters come in a wide variety, but they basically boil down to the regular enemies, blocking enemies, sickening enemies, dragons, level drainers, super beans, and puffballs. The regular enemies aren't very special and always come in a single form, which is part of how you can recognize them when you start encountering new ones deeper in the dungeon. The blocking enemies only come in a couple forms, balls and garbage cans. They're not very strong, but they have a ton of health points, making it difficult to take them out and usually preferable to just run away whenever possible. Sickening enemies are ones that normally come in a yellow variety and are perfectly safe. Well, as safe as an enemy could be, but they also come in black and green varieties, which will induce poison or disease if they strike you. The effects of poison and disease are actually more annoying than they are threatening. Basically, when you're poisoned, every few hundred moves you'll permanently lose a point of strength, and with disease you lose constitution instead. Now there's magic spells to cure these, and you can pay the temple up in town to cure them, but considering you're going to be coming across lots of items which can boost your attributes, these effects really aren't too substantial. Next we have the Puffballs. Now these enemies are interesting because they come in a variety of colors, and the color that they are determines what they're going to do to your attributes when they strike you, after which they'll die and give you some bonus items as usual. The color can be either one of the high colors of the EGA palette, which will raise your attributes, or one of the low colors of the EGA palette, which will reduce your attributes. So long as you know what the EGA color palette is like, you shouldn't have trouble recognizing the differences. Next are the dragons. Now, these enemies are very strong, have a good number of health points, and have the ability to breathe fire, cold, acid, poison, or disease, depending on if their primary color is orange, blue, white, black, or green. Fire breath and cold breath aren't too threatening, except that they do consistent damage and can't be dodged. Acid breath, on the other hand, is very dangerous for characters like the fighter and mage that do lots of melee combat because acid attacks dissolve whatever armor you're wearing. Fortunately, you can just take your armor off for that one battle and then put it back on afterwards. Next, we have the level drainers. Now, these guys are nasty. All they have to do is hit you once, and you can lose up to 3 experience levels, losing all the experience those levels took to get to in the process. Now, recognizing level drainers is actually pretty easy, as they're all either undead creatures or incredibly evil creatures. Things like mummies, vampires, wraiths, demons, that sort of thing. You have 2 options when dealing with a level drainer. Either be absolutely certain your first attack will defeat it, or cast the resist level drain spell so that you can engage in combat without worry. Now this particular spell though is priestly magic, which means the wizard and mage can only use this spell through magical items like scrolls, wands, and papers. Lastly though, we have the super beings. And as far as I know, the only ones that qualify are Zeus's, Devils, and the red dragon bosses. And super beings are special in that many of the different magic spells you have simply don't work against them. In fact, the only ones that do are the ones that generally affect all enemies in the immediate area, like the slow monster spell, or spells that simply do damage. Worse still, they're invulnerable to the holy hand grenades you can find, which will instantly kill all other enemies, and most super beings are also level drainers, making them virtually impossible to kill without level drain resistance. The devils in particular can also sap away your luck points, even if you're resisting level drain. Now, speaking of spells not working, once you're below the 64th floor of the dungeon, ascend spells don't work anymore, meaning the only way you're going to escape the lower levels of the dungeon are through the trap doors. Now, the trapdoors are marked on the map as X's and head to a variety of floors, all multiples of 10, but before you can use a trapdoor, you need the key for it. To get a trapdoor key, you have to defeat a level drainer at or below the dungeon floor of the key you want. For example, if you want the key to the 50th floor, you need to defeat a level drainer anywhere between the 50th and 59th floors. In fact, once you've beaten the first 4 bosses, your next task really should be to get every single trapdoor key so that once you start getting into the really deep floors, you have some way to save yourself if things get out of hand. Though there's also a number of special items you can find that will really help you out. Firstly are the holy hand grenades, which, as I already said, kills enemies in one shot. Next is the floor slosher, which basically just lets you easily descend through the floor if you want to, and can be used a limitless number of times, though it stops working once you get deep enough. Next are the stones of seeing, which when used will completely map out the current dungeon floor save for the chutes, but you just have to go up a ladder and back down again to map them all out. Next are the stones of teleportation, which will instantly take you back up to the town and can be used in any situation, so they're a good desperation item. Mind you, raised dead contracts from the temple work pretty much the same way, so if you have tons of money, then these things aren't really that big of a deal. Next are the potions of healing, which can be used at absolutely any moment to restore your health to maximum. Lastly are the rings of regeneration. For each one of these you acquire, you regenerate 1 health point per move you make through the dungeons. Now, before I talk about strategy, I should probably note this game is not without its issues. Firstly, there's a number of inaccuracies and unimplemented features which may confuse new players. For instance, the Sage supposedly gets experience points just for exploring the dungeons, but trust me, this isn't the case. Another example is the permanent spell Youth, which is supposed to reduce your age, but age wasn't properly implemented until the sequel came out, so this spell effectively does nothing but waste 10 maximum spell points. There's also anti-magic rings you can acquire through the use of permanent spells, but since none of the enemies in the game actually cast magic, these rings are useless. I also can't figure out if the invisibility effect actually does anything, because even once you've made yourself permanently invisible, enemies still seem to follow you around just fine, so I don't know. So strategy-wise, there's a number of things you can do to stay alive. Firstly, don't play as the fighter. Ever. Yes, the fighter can wield great swords and wear titanium armor, but the only magic items the fighter can use are spell papers, and finding these things is hard enough, let alone the fact that you rarely find good ones. Secondly, keep in mind that many sections of the dungeons are disconnected from each other, and that staircases and chutes don't always go just one floor. Ladders which cross 2 floors are not uncommon, and chutes which drop you 3 floors are also very possible to come across. For all these reasons, I recommend using magic if you want to go somewhere specific. The relocate, detect level, pass wall, ascend, and descend spells are very useful for getting where you want to go. Thirdly, keep in mind that your chance to hit an enemy and vice versa is partly related to the difference in experience levels. So if you're trying to fight enemies that are much higher in level than you may need to stick with magic to do the job. And speaking of which, never take on level drainers with melee attacks until you've either cast Hold Monster or Resist Level Drain, because the last thing you want to do is lose half an hour or more of experience points. Also, speaking of which, always take on level drainers when you can, because they're worth a ton of experience points. Plus they can drop trapdoor keys and also usually drop special vitamin pills that boost one of your attributes by 4 points while dropping another by 2, giving you a net increase of 2 attribute points. Next, if you ever run into an enemy you don't want to fight because it's too low in level or would take too many spell points to deal with compared to what you would get for the effort, just use the Go Away spell. It's cheap to cast and works on virtually anything. Next, never pick up copper or silver stones when you find stone piles because they're simply not worth the wait. Heck, once you get far enough, don't even pick up platinum. Yes, 1 platinum stone is worth 5 jewel pieces, but platinum stones have weight in this game, while jewel stones do not. And if you happen to be carrying too much weight, you're not even allowed to pick up the jewel stones. So obviously, once you're far enough, only pick up the jewel stones. My final tip once again deals with the level drainers. Specifically, if your level does indeed get drained and afterwards the level drainer has more experience points than you do, then whatever you do, kill that level drainer. Even if you lose more levels in the process. What it comes down to is that level drainers have the most experience points of any kind of enemy and are also fairly uncommon. So if they drain you down and you run from battle, you're going to have to face a whole bunch of regular enemies just to get your experience points back up, as opposed to just that one level drainer. Yeah, the wilderness. This is more or less just a snazzy little landscape generator to serve as the backdrop for selecting the pseudo-randomization seed for the dungeons you explore. Once you enter the wilderness, all mapping progress is lost, so it's better not to go out here unless it's near the start of the game or you're just really fed up with the dungeon you're in for whatever reason. And yeah, that's Moraff's world. Now that I've talked about it a bit, I think the reason why it's fun is because it feels like the kind of game a child would make given half the chance and the skill to pull it off. So it feels more like you're playing a game that you're imagining and fantasizing about rather than a game with obvious rules and polished graphics. If not for that, this game would probably suck. But as it stands, it's fun to play despite its problems, and even if you don't want to buy the full game, the shareware version pretty much has most of the game intact and can be downloaded from just about anywhere. So trying it before you commit to buying it is still very doable. Dosbox settings are somewhat interesting. But firstly, you need to set the cycles count to a fixed value as high as you can get it before the mouse cursor starts to stutter around. Now I recommend a setting of 50,000, but if you can set it higher without any issues, then do so. Secondly, if you want to get the 1024 by 768 graphics working, you need to set the machine type to SVGA_ET4000. Then, when you start the game, select option A for 1024 by 768, followed by option 1 to use the Desceng Labs graphics chipset. Anyways, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week on episode 87, we're going to boldly go where no janitor's gone before. Yeah, you guys know which game this is, so make sure you send your guess as fast as you can to adg@pixelships.com and tune in next Saturday as we try to figure out just how many ways you can die in this game.